You're probably going to have a hard time remembering the myriad of stratagems available to every faction in 40k, but if you don't know them, then there's every chance that your units are going to get hamstrung by massive extra abilities that you weren't aware of. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking rules bloat in 40k 9th edition, particularly focusing on stratagems. I feel they are quite a fun mechanic that allows you to do lots of cool things in game, but I think quite a lot of people would list them amongst the problems with 40k 9th edition, and I can't help but think that Games Workshop might well change them a fair bit whenever 10th does eventually roll around. With that in mind, let's talk through some of the positives of stratagems, some of the major criticisms, and a few ways to maybe help balance out the massive amount of rules bloat while still being able to put down a few awesome command abilities on the table. So stratagems were introduced in 40k 8th edition, a new mechanic where you got command points and then you could spend them on powerful individual abilities in game. I must admit, just for the idea of them, I do quite like them, allowing your troops and units to do special moves when they need to most, and it's also quite a nice way of realising a lot of flavour mechanics in the game, fun bits of arcane war gear, or special battle tactics available to certain armies. I think there's really quite a lot of positives to them. Firstly, they're another resource that you can manage, and it can lead to some genuine tricky decisions, such as do I really want to re-roll that crucial saving throw, or do I need to save that command point for interrupting in combat next turn, or using this unit's special damage dealing ability, which could lead to a lot more enemy casualties in a turn or two. I think it definitely leads to different ways that you can command the same force, whether you plough a lot of stratagems into damage moves, or use a lot of durability and mobility ones to get around the table. There do seem to be a fairly reasonable way of balancing detachments and things as well, and it sort of works okay from a narrative standpoint as well. If you're fielding a lot of diverse forces, you're going to have fewer command points as they're going to be harder to coordinate. I think the command rerolls actually really quite a nice bit of game design. It allows you to reroll important crucial moves or failed saves, times when the RNG gods might have punished you a bit, and can be another small barrier against the worst excesses of bad luck in game. As I mentioned, I do quite like the extra flavour. For example, you can have Space Marines Auspex scanning enemy reserves to try and intercept them, or loading things like Hellfire shells into their heavy bolters to access a different type of damage. A lot of them do feel really quite visceral, like you can imagine your forces doing that given move that you've just ordered them to do. Otherwise, I think that unit-specific stratagems often encourage a little bit less spam as well, and more unit variety on the table. They can make two similar units function really quite differently. Say for example in the Space Marine Codex, the Whirlwind and the Thunderfire Cannon might be relatively close together, but the Whirlwind allows enemy units to fight last and can ignore Overwatch, where the Thunderfire Cannon can use its Tremor Shells to slow down enemy units. It also means that there's a bit more value in having just one of a specific unit. If it has a good stratagem, then you might well include it, when otherwise you might have passed it up. It also might mean that you won't want multiples of one given squad, as the first one will be extra good because he can use its stratagem each turn, but as he can only use it once per unit per phase, the second one will have to go without. Otherwise, it's another reason to try and encourage some slightly bigger blocks of units. In general, the most efficient damage dealers do tend to be multiple small units, so another incentive to take big squads isn't the worst idea, and despite a fair bit of criticism, I don't really think that they're inherently unbalanced in any way. They're just one factor that goes towards the strength of an army in combination with the points and their rules. GW often have adjusted the command point cost of certain really excessive stratagems, so it's not like they can't be rebalanced if they do really become a problem. So while I do quite like them as a concept, I think there are a couple of major criticisms that you can make about them in 9th, predominantly the fact that there's absolutely loads of them for every single army, and this can lead to feels bad gotcha moments on the table, things that your opponent just would have no way of seeing coming unless you deliberately tell them. The 9th edition codexes are packed full of rules, and stratagems are no exception, almost every single army having 2 double pages worth of stratagems now, so most armies do have a really big amount to choose from. For a new player picking up an army, or even picking up 40k in general, it is going to provide a bit of a learning curve, theoretically having to keep a whole bunch of potential options in your head, as well as also remembering all unit stats and what you want to be doing with them otherwise. I think that actually the vast majority of players in 40k probably don't know every single stratagem in their own codex, just because there's a whole bunch that you either basically never use or would only come up in really quite niche circumstances, so if you don't read through the section a couple of times on a regular basis, you're probably going to gradually forget that some of them exist. Obviously that just gets ridiculously harder if you're trying to keep track of the stratagems of 20 odd different armies in the game. Hopefully you might remember some of their biggest and nastiest tricks, but you're almost certainly not going to remember the niche surprises from every single faction, and certainly for people who play less regularly, You might well just be turning up to a game with very little idea as to what sort of stratagems your opponent might pull out. The biggest issue that this causes, I think, are basically when you have gotcha moments, maybe most typically when a surprise stratagem ruins your plans, a move that your opponent could make, but not one that you necessarily knew that they could make. And say, if you'd known that that stratagem had existed in the first place, you might have acted very differently, whether it was not trying to charge a certain unit, taking a threat a bit more seriously, or just not positioning your units in a certain way. I think perhaps the biggest and most obvious example is Auspex scan, 2 CP for your Space Marines to shoot at reserves within 12 inches of them. Whenever it basically leads to a Space Marine unit just obliterating an enemy squad, that usually means that the opponent's probably forgotten that the stratagem exists, as it's not typically going to be worth it to allow them to use that stratagem. Various examples of that exist though, maybe intercept or heroic intervention type moves are some of the biggest and most surprising, though the same could be true of just any damage, defensive or movement buff. Say for example, if you just charge a melee squad into a unit that you think they'll be able to handle easily, then your opponent pulls out some sort of big defensive stratagem like -1 damage, and it actually winds up that your unit just does nothing and then gets wiped out in return. In general, I think players do make a bit of an effort to try and mitigate this, trying to say any of the biggest surprise moves that they have in the army pre-game so it doesn't cause issues when it comes up, but I certainly don't like the way that it kind of gives an advantage to the players that don't go out of their way to provide that kind of information, kind of rewarding players who just embrace gotchas to the max. I'd say that that's generally the biggest problem with stratagems right now, the bloat and not being able to keep track of other people's, though I think there are other reasons to criticise them. A few of them do just feel a bit arbitrary and not really things that you'd actually command your squad to do. Some of the defensive ones really seem like that, say for example transhuman physiology for the Space Marines, or the -1 damage for Thousand Suns Rubric Marines. A lot of them just feel like this unit gets a lot tougher this turn just because I said so. It doesn't really represent them doing any sort of special manoeuvre in the lore or anything. It just feels a bit weird that you can yell at your troops to be more tough for a turn, and they just happen to do so. Also, going with the bloat, it does mean that quite a lot of them are just completely redundant, stratagems that are almost never going to get played in game, and also so niche to be worth it that you might just forget them even if a good situation does exist. I guess that is kind of something that you can level at quite a lot of 40k though. A lot of warlord traits, relics, or units are going to be fairly redundant in the strongest list in the game, though that's not really a reason to get rid of all the suboptimal choices. So overall, I do feel that stratagems do have some issues, and I strongly suspect that Games Workshop will make some tweaks to the formula whenever the next edition comes out. I would be surprised if they went for anything too radical before then. I feel like most people can perhaps get behind having 20 to 40 potential surprise moves at every player's disposal probably isn't good for the game, though there are decent ways that you can mitigate it. Often having a good pre-game discussion with your opponent about surprise moves on both sides can make people pretty happy about their opponent's abilities pre-game. It really does look like Games Workshop are aware of the criticisms, as that community survey that they did a few months back had a few questions focused specifically on stratagems. Kind of interesting, seeing as a lot of the other questions were kind of vague or nebulous. Kind of interesting to see them getting called out individually. I've certainly seen a lot of potential fixes thrown around for stratagems, often down from yourselves in YouTube comments, and I think there are a fair few options for reducing their negative impacts on the game. I feel like a fair amount of people wouldn't be too sad if stratagems just went away entirely. Personally, I'd rather not see that happen. I think a lot of them do bring some quite fun moves, and a lot of them do seem quite immersive and visceral for what you'd imagine your Space Marines or Xenos could be doing in-game. Otherwise, if you were doing a major shake-up, you could perhaps shift the bulk of stratagems to be core rules ones as opposed to ones strewn throughout the codexes. If the majority of options that you have access to are ones that everyone has, then most players are going to remember them a lot better as they're the same options that are available to their army. That way you might only have a few codex specific ones to remember that your opponent can do, and have a bit less mental load. I've seen a few people suggesting that stratagems should be just one use only, preventing spam of stratagems in game. I guess it could make them feel a bit more like individual special moves, but it doesn't really affect the gotcha situation in any way. A few people have suggested maybe having stratagems as an option that you could pick for your army when you're mustering your list. Maybe you get access to the generic stratagems, then maybe something like 3 to 6 codex specific ones, drawn from the big list of everything that you have access to. That would actually give you a more manageable number, and because they're recorded on your army list, you could actually talk through your opponent pre-game to make sure they understand roughly what they do. I guess that could exacerbate the issue of redundant stratagems though. I feel like if that were the case, you'd wind up taking very similar ones for most games, and a lot of them would just be completely ignored if they were a bit more niche or situational. Finally, another option could be to make a lot of stratagems just built into a certain unit's datasheet. A few of them effectively have this already, say for example, fighting twice is only something that the Space Marine Assault Intercessors could do. So maybe if you listed their stratagem on their datasheet as opposed to in the stratagems section, you'd remember a bit more easily that that's something that that unit can do, and it doesn't just get lost in the mess of the other stratagems within the book. Maybe that wouldn't necessarily have the biggest impact, but at least when you're talking about what your units can do in the army, it might be a bit more obvious to say, these are these guys, they have these stats, and their stratagem ability is to be able to fight twice for 2 CP. Perhaps not the biggest change, but maybe it might help out a little bit. In any case, just a few potential ideas there. I certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback down in the comments. Do you like stratagems as they are in 40k? Do you think that they need to be reduced in some way? And if so, how would you go about cutting down a bit of the bloat while still preserving some flavourful rules? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.